This is a summary of the circumstances leading up to the election fraud of the 2004 Taiwan election. On March 18th, the KMT PFP ticket Lian and Song had about a 10% or 1.5 million ballot advantage over incumbent Chen Shui-bian. Chen Shui-bian was made aware of the actual poll, the internal government poll, on March 18th. The voter lists for the election were prepared by the Central Election Commission well in advance to stuff ballots for Chen Shui-bian. The National Defense Minister appointed by Chen adjusted the shift change of the troops to 8 a.m. so that a certain number of them could not vote in the election. Generally, the shift change happens at 12 noon. This prevented approximately 100,000 military personnel from voting. The March 19th incident was planned months in advance. The Pan Blue campaign headquarters was warned of the 319 incident in advance, however did nothing to prepare for it. They didn't believe it. Chen Yisheng, a father of 4, was identified as the patsy in advance and set up by his brother-in-law and underground elements in Tainan City. The March 19th incident was done with many identifiable mistakes. The 319 incident reduced the gap to around 6%, or around 900,000 ballots. Jane Song asked for the election to be stopped. The KMT party and the Lian camp wanted the election to continue. This is due to the fact that the polls indicated that the Lian and Song ticket would still win by 5 to 6%. The election would have continued regardless of any type of request. The KMT PFP alliance sent monitors to only half of the 13,749 voting stations. The election fraud in stations had no correlation with whether the KMT PFP monitor was present or not. That means that there was cheating where there was a KMT PFP monitor, or there was no cheating when one wasn't present also. Many overseas Chinese had their ballot taken from them in the voter lists. Some of the people who had voted according to the voter list died before election day. This is due to the fact that the voter lists were pre-stamped by the Central Election Commission. People who generally weren't voting had their votes cast for them. Stamps were made to pre-stamp these names. Fraud included 3 types: stuffing Chen Shui-bian ballots, approximately 400,000, stealing Lian Zhan ballots, approximately 400,000, invalidating valid Lian ballots, 1.55%, or 200,000. Central Election Commission paused ballot count to confirm Chen actually won. The results came out late due to election fraud. The exit poll done in 3 phases, that is, the early morning, the late morning, and the early afternoon, indicated Lian won by a margin of 53 to 47 each time. Pollster Warren Matovsky in New York was absolutely sure that Lian had won the election until he saw the official results. The real purpose of the referendum election was to be counted alongside the presidential ballots to rig the presidential election. The head of the voting station would often appoint the KMT PFP monitor to look at the referendum box instead of the presidential box. This is why the presidential ballot box needs to be counted alone. However, the election staff always count the second box with the presidential ballot box in order to rig the presidential election more easily. It makes things more confusing when there's 2 boxes being opened at the same time, even if it doesn't actually save time. Fraud still occurred when the KMT PFP monitor was present due to inability to stop fraud or due to being bought off. Ballots were spoiled with ink and other methods to make them invalid even in the recount. That is, when the ballots were recounted, they were still invalid because they were spoiled. The Invalid Ballot Alliance made little to no impact on the number of invalid ballots. The true percentage of invalid ballots is around 1% according to the exit poll. Adjustments were made to the total ballots for each candidate due to administrative errors by the election staff. All elections in Taiwan will have some administrative errors in ballot report tables. The administrative recount was done station by station with the ballot report tables. The opposition KMT party had a copy of all ballot report tables as required by law. No computer fraud in 2004 was found or any other election thereafter. Pan Blue lawyers made no mention of any station with computer fraud. The 2004 lawsuit centered around illegal cases in the voter lists. The Chen Shui-bian government was fully prepared for possible riots in Taipei City. This was due to the fact that they had planned to rig the election for a long time. Containing riots was a part of their plan. There was no possibility for a coup d'etat, even if some people were thinking of it. The Pan Blue camp was informed by the CCP the night of the election a pending attack due to perceived US backing of Chen to rig the election. Each time the DPP rigs a presidential election, this is perceived by Beijing to be an aggressive move preventing peaceful unification with the PRC. Evidence of the fake 319 incident was kept from the public by certain persons in the opposition camp. Certain persons in the blue camp helped Chen maintain election victory to pave the way for Ma Ying-jeou in 2008. Some collusion between DPP and some parts of the KMT already started in 2004. Dr. Henry Lee's team was set up before the election and rushed to Taiwan due to the PFP press conference held on April 9th. The team was hired and did not volunteer their time as Dr. Lee claimed. Hou Youyi of the CIB covered up the incident and framed Chen Yishong on the orders of Chen Shui-bian. Chen Yishong was most likely murdered and the family was coerced to confess by the CIB. Dr. Henry Lee's report and statements were used by Hou to frame Chen Yishong. Mistakes in the evidence were covered up by Photoshop or disregarded. The election lawsuits were handled very unprofessionally by the court. The judges intimidated opposition lawyers into not revealing fraud to the media. The judges manipulated the entire opposition camp into keeping quiet about the fraud found in the voter lists. Widespread and obvious evidence found in voter lists indicating they had been prepared in advance for stuffing. Pan-Green attorneys made little effort to argue the illegal cases in the voter lists. The judges dismissed most of the illegal cases in the voter lists with logical excuses. The entire Green camp, from the media to the lawyers to the judges, used logical excuses to deny fraud. By Q3 2005, both the 319 incident and election lawsuits were settled. Chen Shui-bian essentially delayed his incarceration by 4 years. Chen Shui-bian and Ma Ying-jeou benefited the most from the 2004 election. The 2004 election also paved the way for Tsai Ing-wen due to the inherent weakness of Ma Ying-jeou as a national leader. The illegal cases found in the voter lists are detailed in Huang Zixian's book. In the following video, Dr. Li Fudian details the illegal cases in the voter lists himself.
那我们在整个诉讼的过程当中，我们向法院提出来的这个跟指印领票有关的违法有162575例，这个里面有指印模糊的，有指印有十字纹的，有指印有波浪纹的，有指印是尖尖的一个指尖点一下的，这些总共我们提出来有怀疑的是162575例。这个部分因为法院不让我们去阅览选举人名册，他也不对这个部分加以认定，所以这个部分就不在法院的这个认定范围内。有代领选票，这个李某某写个张某某代就领走，居然可以找到4票，这是我们找到的，并不表示只有4票啊。那像这个签章跟选举人姓名不符，你怎么会有这个领票的人签名跟选举人的名票不符？怎么可能有这种事情呢？我李富店会去签名就是签张富店吗？这种情形有6949人已经死了或者在服刑当中的，我们找到的有86人，这是我们能找到的。要找到这些是多困难的事情，我们都找到了有86人，法院没有采，法院根本就没有去阅览名册，所以这些东西都没有办法去采认。签名相同的我们发现在名册上面我们可以看到签名这个笔法相同就有2956人，指印相同的我们有16000人。这个选务人员违法在户籍选地领票有84人，没有拿身份证明没有拿身份证去领票的有5548人。在我们的这个选罢法的规定里面，只有用身份证才能领票，可是，在选举的过程当中，却被用所谓的身份证明文件，就遗失身份证，去拿一个单子，说是我的身份证掉了，这样去领的，这是没有法律依据的。领了 这个5000多张。那这个印文没有办法辨识，有42000多笔。这里面有的是盖图章盖出来就是一个红红的方块，或者盖出来的图章是一个框框，里面没有字的，这种没有办法辨识，有4万多。双重领票，在一个格子里面盖2个图章，有900多票。冒领选票涂改的有4万多票。那名册里面已经写了被冒领掉的有12人，那还有一些其他的。我们看下一个，我们加起来的这个数字是28万票，28万票。那我们的差距是多少呢？下一个，两边的差距是25000票，而我们所提出来的质疑是28万票。那这么大的差距，法院就以不查选举人名册的方式，就把我们给这个忽略掉了啊。所以从这种我们法院所提出来的基础，法院判我们败诉，是我们绝对不能够接受的。
So that was a summary from Dr. Li Fudian, who was on the attorney team for the Pan-Blue Alliance. The 280,182 illegal cases are basically ballot stuffing. That's the number of cases that they were able to confirm in the voter list when they were allowed to look at them. But the court dismissed most of the cases, claiming that election fraud is theoretically not possible because the election staff check the ID of the voters when they come into the station. However, this is not relevant. It's the election staff that are being accused of falsifying the voter lists and stuffing ballots. This is a timeline of the exit poll conducted by TVBS. TVBS hired college students in Taiwan to interview every 5th voter that came out of the voting stations that they were at. 100 was deemed sufficient by Matovsky. TVBS planned to poll 150 voting stations. However, in actuality, 147 voting stations were interviewed that day, which is more than the 100 suggested by Matovsky. Matovsky compiled the results and came up with the result 53-47 in favor of Lian.
那还有一个因素呢，是蛮值得去检讨的，就是说民众回答废票的比例呢，他们认为他们自己投废票的比例是1%，也就是说有13万的选票是1%，但是中选会开出来的结果的废票呢是33万票。所以跟民众的认知差距呢可能太远，所以会造成这样的一个结果。
So what he's saying is that out of the 147 voting stations interviewed, the voters reported voting invalid ballots approximately 1%. That's 130,000 invalid ballots. However, the official number of invalid ballots in the election is over 330,000.
And then she backs up. No, it's not. It's invalid. And so she takes back the vote. And she shows it to everybody, and we saw the vote, but we found out why she decided it had to be invalid. Because the circle was not put squarely in the box, in that space where the circle was supposed to be drawn. Instead, the circle was drawn below the line and next to the picture of the candidate that person wanted to vote for. But because it was not in that box, it was declared to be invalid. I bring this up because apparently coinciding with this election was an effort by the two parties to become more rigorous about what actually should be considered a valid vote. In other words, a valid ballot here. And so this was also very interesting because so that explains sort of part of why there are so many invalid votes. But the other part that's very interesting, and I'll stop with this comment, is that there also apparently while this was all going on, there was a movement, there was a campaign to have people go to the polling places and actually purposely invalidate their ballot. There was apparently something called, and Tom can correct me, it's called the Spoiled Ballot Alliance. Oh, that's right, you were gone there that day. In any case, this was given to me, this information was given by a number of people, and people were talking about this. There was a certain individual who actually organized this campaign. So that would explain why you'd have so many other invalid ballots other than just something fishy going on.
Okay, so she's referring to the Invalid Ballot Alliance done by Zhen Chunqi. Did this invalid ballot alliance really account for the 200,000 additional invalid ballots in this election? I will show in this video that this was certainly not the case because the distribution of the ballots indicate that they were done by the election staff on purpose. If it was due to stricter standards implemented by the Central Election Commission or this invalid ballot alliance or any other factors like people are just too uneducated to vote, the distribution of the invalid ballots would have been more normal. Therefore, the real invalid ballot rate in this election is probably just around 1% and not 2.55%, over 200,000 invalid ballots created by the staff. This is an election panel discussion at UC Berkeley on April 19th. 3 out of 4 of the professors were in Taiwan to observe the election. Dr. Richard Baum from UCLA was there and thinks that there's nothing wrong with the invalid ballots because he thinks the DPP has nothing to hide in the recount.
And the issue, of course, there were 2 demands that the KMT-PFP made. The first was for a recount. They would change the outcome. Chen Shui-bian and the DPP did some calculations of their own and realized that those invalid ballots really were invalid, so yes, let's do a recount by all means. Putting the ball back in the KMT court, and the KMT then shifted their ground and said negotiating and bickering.
Dr. Baum is the only professor out of these 4 that I did not interview, but he was clearly laughing at the Pan-Blue Alliance. He didn't think there was anything wrong with the election. He was fully backing the DPP. I interviewed Dr. Scalapino at his home, and he also didn't think there was anything wrong with the election. He didn't go to Taiwan, but his position was very clear. He basically said there was no evidence of fraud. Dr. Thomas Gold was also at the Stanford election panel discussion, where he was extremely critical of the Pan-Blue camp's actions after the election. He was a part of a group of Western observers that went to the voting stations and saw nothing out of the ordinary.
What they have been doing is inviting foreign experts on Taiwan or on China or on democratization, on civil society, on electoral processes and so on, to come and see how elections are carried out in a case that not many people know very well. So it's a wonderful source of data for social scientists, but it is not by any stretch of the imagination an opportunity for foreigners to give the seal of approval that this has been a fair election. Though certainly, and again I would agree with what Rick said, most people who have come away from the elections in Taiwan, in particular this one, have stressed that the procedure is quite fair and open and transparent. Watching the voting process, watching the counting process, it looks as if it is really very difficult to commit fraud. Certainly in the old days when I first started observing elections, when the DPP had just been established, there were a lot of opportunities for fraud to be committed, and most of that, of course, was done by the KMT. Various ways of tampering with the election procedure, the counting procedure, unexplained power failures, so vote buying, all kinds of gifts, and so on. So there were a lot of irregularities, but most of these irregularities have disappeared.
So Dr. Gold's general position is that there was fraud in Taiwan before being committed by the KMT, but there's not anymore. This is the common perception by Westerners and pan-Green supporters that election fraud stopped once Taiwan became more democratized. However, it hasn't stopped. In fact, it's gotten worse. We can also see Dr. Lowell Dittmer on the left-hand side. He also went to Taiwan to observe the elections and saw nothing out of the ordinary. Dr. Lowell Dittmer is an expert on China, so he doesn't have a strong position on Taiwan politics. The main issue with the Western perspective on Taiwan's elections is that they aren't looking at the details. They're looking at what the DPP government wants them to see, which are voting stations where there's no fraud occurring. However, there's over 13,000 voting stations in Taiwan at that time, and there was no way for them to get updated information on what happened in all 13,749 voting stations. They also probably didn't follow up on the details of the lawsuit or the distribution of the invalid ballots, which was public information, but that would be too detailed. Taiwan is far more complex than the West understands, and the experts speaking at top universities in the United States aren't going to look at those details.
这次总统的大选是第一次有人主张投废票。过去台湾的每一次投票里面呢，平均都差不多有10万票上下，它是一个废票产生，可能是投错，也可能是抱怨，也可能是表达一个政治上的不满。 可是我们这次是有意识的透过政治上的运动，彻底的主张要站出来投废票，那从而得了30几万的这个票数。严格讲呢，如果不是说这一次连宋跟扁吕的差票数只有2万多，不到3万，这个30几万的废票不会引起这么多的重视。因为人们一开始解释说，连宋他们会输掉，都是因为废票的关系，所以反而把废票的作用夸大了。但是废票的作用没有那么大，但是它不是决定连宋的胜负的。因为我的分析是说，这一次会投废票的，搞不好很多是以前是总统选举是投绿的。为什么会是这样子呢？因为绿的很多是本来是比较理想主义者，他们这几年看到陈水扁越来越堕落，看到民进党越来越退步，所以呢，他们很想表达他们的不满。反而是蓝的本身呢，基本上虽然很讨厌陈水扁，可是他们一直很想改变这个政局，所以他们319那2颗子弹之后，大家更紧张了。
So he's trying to claim that the additional 200,000 invalid ballots were mostly pan-green supporters that were upset with the DPP party. Well, I don't know where he's getting that from, but that's how he claims that he wasn't responsible for the election loss. Well, in my opinion, there's no need for him to defend himself because whatever he did didn't impact the election much at all, if anything. In fact, I think it had basically no impact on the election. So he's not guilty of doing anything. In fact, for him to think that the 330,000 ballots were due to him and what he did is rather presumptuous of him. The real purpose of the Invalid Ballot Alliance was for the Green camp and for people to make an excuse for why there were so many invalid ballots in the election. It was basically a smokescreen. So whoever backed it was obviously helping the Chen Shui-bian government.
我发觉这个废票非常多，刚开始都发觉废票非常多，然后后来只去研究这个废票的这个模式，我发觉除了作票以外，没有其他合理的因素可以解释，就发觉这一次大选这个废票不合理的增加很多啊。所谓的不合理，就是说一方面它整体的数量多了很多，而且它的分布非常非常的不平均。以台北县来讲，很多这个废票，大部分的废票都是集中在那个偏远的地区，还有偏绿的地区。
So he's saying that the invalid ballot rate from station to station is clearly irregular. It's jumping up and down. And that in Taipei County, a lot of the invalid ballots are in faraway places like Sanchong and Luzhou, which I will show later. So the graphs I'm about to show of the invalid ballot rate in all 25 cities and counties in the 2004 election suggest that the additional invalid ballots were created by the election staff and not the voters. Therefore, the 1% approximation from the exit poll is probably correct. So here are the invalid ballot rates from 2000, 2004, and 2008. 2000 was 0.96%, and 2008 was 0.89%. What sticks out is 2004 with 2.55%. Generally, the invalid ballots in Taiwan are just over 100,000, but in 2004, it was 337,000. So let's see if these were produced by the election staff abnormally or if this was due to some other natural factor. So this is the invalid ballot rate for the 2004 election in Taipei City. On the x-axis, we have the voting station number. There's 1,225 voting stations. On the y-axis, we have the invalid ballot rate percentage. So the citywide invalid ballot rate was 1.9%, which means that for the invalid ballot rate to go between maybe 1 to 3% is fairly normal. So we can see that it spikes up abnormally in a few places, suggesting that it may have been manufactured by the election staff. In comparison to the invalid ballot rate in 2008 in Taipei City, we can see that the variance is much smaller. The invalid ballot rate is only 0.79%. There are not only far less invalid ballots, but the invalid ballot rate doesn't spike up as much. This is 2004 in Taipei City once again. This is the invalid ballot rate in Taipei County. We can see that it is higher at 2.42%, but it is also particularly high at the very end. Those areas are Sanchong and Luzhou. In those pan-green areas, the election staff get more bold with invalidating valid ballots. That's why it's spiking up like that. In 2008, the invalid ballot rate in Taipei County went down to 0.94%. We can still see that it spikes up a little bit at the end there. And here's 2004 again. The invalid ballot rate in Jilin City in 2004 was 2.2%. In 2008, it was 0.75%. Here's 2004 again. The invalid ballot rate in Yilan County in 2004 was 3.35%. You can see it's spiking up very abnormally here. But the invalid ballot rate in 2008 was 0.78%. And here's 2004 once again. The invalid ballot rate in Taoyuan County in 2004 was 2.98%. But in 2008, it was 0.95%. And here's 2004 again. The invalid ballot rate in Hsinchu City in 2004 was 2.33%, but in 2008 it was 0.89%. Here's 2004 again. The invalid ballot rate in Hsinchu County in 2004 was 2.55%, but in 2008 it was 0.96%. And here's 2004 again. In Miaoli County, the invalid ballot rate in 2004 was 3.34%. But in 2008, it was 0.92%. And here's 2004 again. The invalid ballot rate in Taiwan City in 2004 was 1.84%. Keep in mind that this city is under KMT control. But in 2008, the invalid ballot rate was 0.97%. My point about Taiwan City and Taipei City and other cities under KMT control is that it doesn't matter if they're under KMT control. Systematic election fraud is still taking place in these cities and counties. In other words, it's the Central Election Commission that can assign the election staff to these cities and counties so that systematic election fraud can occur. The key election staff personnel are not being sent from the city government, but everybody in Taiwan believes that this is the case. Instead of looking at the hard data to find the truth, people just believe a saying. And everybody just says it over and over again, and nobody checks to see if it's actually true. The invalid ballot rate in Taichung County in 2004 was 2.44%, but in 2008 it was 1.01%. And here's 2004 again. The invalid ballot rate in Zhanghua County in 2004 was 3.46%. This is one of the highest in the nation. But in 2008 it was only 1.03%. And here's 2004 again. The invalid ballot rate in Yunlin County in 2004 was 3.99%, but in 2008 it was only 0.88%. And here's 2004 again. The invalid ballot rate in Nantou County in 2004 was 2.85%, but in 2008 it was 0.84%. And here's 2004 again. Once again, we're looking at the distribution of the invalid ballots and not just the total. The invalid ballot rate in Jiayi City in 2004 was 1.86%, but in 2008 it was only 0.75%. And here's 2004 again. The invalid ballot rate in Jiayi County in 2004 was 3.51%, but in 2008 it was only 0.95%. And here's 2004 again. The invalid ballot rate in Tainan City in 2004 was 1.86%. But in 2008, it was 0.87%. Here's 2004 again. The invalid ballot rate in Tainan County in 2004 was 2.88%. But in 2008, it was only 0.88%. Here's 2004 again. The invalid ballot rate in Kaohsiung City in 2004 was 1.64%. But in 2008, it was only 0.78%. And here's 2004 again. The invalid ballot rate in Kaohsiung County in 2004 was 2.92%, but in 2008 it was only 0.8%. And here's 2004 again. The invalid ballot rate in Pingdong County in 2004 was 2.51%, but in 2008 it was only 0.76%. And here's 2004 again. The invalid ballot rate in Taidong County in 2004 was 2.67%. But in 2008, it was only 0.87%. And here's 2004 again. The invalid ballot rate in Hualien County in 2004 was 2.45%. But in 2008, it was only 1.1%. And here's 2004 again. The invalid ballot rate in Penghu County in 2004 was 2.64%. But in 2008, it was only 0.83%. And here's 2004 again. The invalid ballot rate in Jinmen County in 2004 was 3.66%, but in 2008 it was only 0.49%. And here's 2004 again. We can see that there's no pattern to the election staff invalidating ballots. Whether it's deep green or deep blue areas, it's all the same. They do it everywhere. The invalid ballot rate in Lianzhang County in 2004 was 2.63%. But for 2008, it was only 0.42%. And here's 2004 again. So looking at the invalid ballot rates from 1996 to 2020, we can clearly see that 2004 is the anomaly. It's not an exaggeration that these additional invalid ballots were created on purpose. Here's the invalid ballot rates for 2012, 2016, and 2020. We can see that the invalid ballot rate is a little bit too high in 2016 in particular. There was definitely some irregularity going on in that election. However, it didn't influence the outcome of the election. However, in 2004, it did in fact influence the outcome of the election on the invalid ballots alone, because the difference between the two candidates was only 29,158. If the election staff produced around 200,000 additional invalid ballots from valid ballots, then we have an issue here. We have an issue here that cannot be addressed by an administrative recount, because if you recount invalid ballots, they'll still be invalid because they've been spoiled by the election staff. These graphs don't prove that it was Lian and Song's ballots that were being invalidated. However, they do prove that the ballots were invalidated on purpose by the staff. We also know that the rumors spread by the Green camp right after the election that most of the invalid ballots belong to Chen Shui-bian is certainly not true. There is no way anyone could know that because the recount had not been done yet. Also, we can see that in deep blue areas, the number of invalid ballots is also very high. So therefore, the generalization that deep green areas have higher invalid ballot rates is not really true. They were targeting valid ballots all over the nation. Therefore, there's no reason to believe that more DPP ballots were invalidated than KMT ballots. We can only say that the invalid ballots were done on purpose. And since it was Lian and Song that were cheated in this election, it's obvious that it was Lian Zan's ballots that were targeted by the election staff. Here's an interview of Warren Matosky on June 25, 2006, after he saw the invalid ballot rate distribution from 2000 to 2004. Warren Matosky did not believe that the 2004 election was rigged, because he generally doesn't believe election fraud is possible. However, after he saw the difference between the invalid ballot rate distributions, he had to admit that there was something wrong with the 2004 election.
When I looked at the vote by polling place, I noticed that there were lots of discrepancies or differences in the number of invalid ballots from polling places that were next to each other, and I wondered why. And I don't think that the voters that live next to each other are all that different from each other. The officials in the neighboring polling places had to be doing something different in the polling places with a high number of invalid ballots as compared to the ones next door that had low numbers of invalid ballots. So I'm curious as to why the officials did something different from one polling place to the next. Well, the number of invalid ballots in the 2000 election were quite similar when you looked from one polling place to the next. When you looked at the 2004 election, the number of invalid ballots varied quite a bit from one polling place to the next, even when they were right next door to each other. Well, I'm still looking for an explanation as to why the 2004 election had much more variation in the number of invalid ballots from polling places that were next to each other than the 2000 election had. It seems that the officials in 2004 were not acting consistently from one polling place to the next. And in 2000 they were consistent. And I don't know what produced the difference, but it's clear that polling place officials were not behaving the same in polling places that were near each other. Well, when I said they weren't behaving the polling place officials in neighboring polling places were not following the same procedures when they invalidated ballots.
So to summarize the invalid ballot rate issue in 2004, the 1% estimate would give about 132,517 invalid ballots. The official number of invalid ballots on election day was 337,297. Therefore, the difference would be about 204,780. The difference between the two candidates was 29,158. Once again, this was only a portion of the election fraud, about 20%. The other 80% was traditional ballot stuffing and ballot theft. That's the Central Election Commission chairperson in 2000 and 2004, George Wong, that was appointed by former President Lee Dong-hui and kept on by former President Chen Shui-bian at that time.
因为我们的时机就是今天晚上，拖得越久，越可以让他们再次的来欺骗，用不公正不义的这种手段赢了，是不能够让百姓服气的。
That was James Song's wife, Chen Wan-shui. She's saying that the last election in the year 2000 was also rigged, and now they've been cheated again in 2004. So I hope everyone can see why Western analysis of Taiwan elections is superficial and not detail-oriented. Regardless of the status of these professors, they're simply not looking at all of the data and they're relying too much on hearsay, basically stories, and limited observations of the voting stations in the elections. You can't just go to 2 voting stations and say there's nothing wrong here. In order to understand what's going on in the entire nation, you have to look at statistical analysis of all 13,000 voting stations. So therefore, typical Western analysis that Lian San and James Song were sore losers in the 2004 election are untrue. They had a legitimate reason to sue the Central Election Commission and ask for an immediate recount, which wasn't granted. The recount did not begin until May, and by that time, the crowds in front of the presidential office had been beaten down by police under the orders of then Taipei City Mayor Ma Ying-jeou, who eventually became president in 2008. The recount did reveal election fraud in the voter list, but as we've already stated, the court basically threw out all the evidence.